and gentlemen, welcome. Today is a magnificent day. Sing to me, O muse of the man of many twists and many turns.
Sing to me, muse, the wrath of Peleus' son, Achilles.
What?
Wrath, rage, is the word that begins this book, and to a great extent, and we cannot even call it a book, it exists in a broader tradition that we're going to discuss. To a great extent, this book is an analysis, even a critique of the rage of men. And not just any type of rage. The Greek word they use is manin, which is not just kolos. The Greek word for anger is kolos. It's where we get the English words choleric, melancholy. This is manin, this is rage, like a supernatural entity. The rage of Achilles is a godlike rage. We'll delve into that in a second, but why are we reading this book?
You've guessed it. Yeah. We're discussing about the Iliad, Homer's Iliad. So the Iliad is a collection of poems that was written down by Homer. So you need to understand that those poems were just recited. It was a transmission of poetry, like you can find in multiple villages in Eastern Europe, in the Near East, about a collection of tradition.
Exactly.
Oral tradition that was transmitted from generation to generation. And a guy called Homer one day decided to just write them down.
Well, so even that fact is debated. This is what scholars call the Homeric question. Was Homer even a real person? And was he even one person? As you said, it belongs to an oral tradition of histories. Audiences, because this would be performed usually over the course of a couple of nights with a fire, maybe someone playing the lyre, the beating of a drum. This was a story that we transmitted throughout the generations. And what that means is from time to time there would be slight modifications, although the essence of the story never changes. And so was Homer one person? I think it's better to imagine Homer as being a succession of generations of oral storytellers. And I think we even have to question, therefore, the historicity, the historical accuracy of the Iliad. Did the Iliad even happen? Was Achilles even real? Was Troy even a real place? Because it's been... Memory is decay. The act of recalling memory is
there's a man.
decay.
There's a man who decided to go on a quest and to find the lost city of Troy.
Walter Schliemann, the German archaeologist.
So he simply took the Iliad and he decided to delve into Anatolia, like modern-day Turkey.
Asia Minor,
And he found the lost city of Troy. So we can understand that the story always becomes a legend, the legend a myth. And what was Alexander doing anyways other than emulating Achilles?
Exactly.
He used to take that myth as a story and he used to delve into the principles, the essence of that storytelling.
As Alexander the Great spread the Hellenic culture all over the continent, all over the known world, he did it with the Iliad tucked beneath his pillow.
Exactly.
The same way that in the modern day, the quarterback sleeps with the football in his hand, in the antique day, the world conqueror sleeps with the Iliad beneath his pillow.
We could even say that we've discovered multiple frescoes of the scenes
of the Iliad,
depicted of the Iliad in the border between Syria and Lebanon. So we could even say that the Iliad has a certain historicity, a certain valuable and I would say essence into it. It was a fact. It was
not fiction. We cannot say that it is fiction, but we cannot say that it was 100% accurate either.
It happened.
It happened. Something like that happened. Maybe Achilles wasn't an immortal demigod or something, or a half-mortal demigod or something like that. But there probably was, centuries and centuries ago, a supernaturally talented warrior whose presence or absence on the battlefield afflicted the tide of war. There probably was an arrogant leader resembling Agamemnon. There probably was a clever guy, deceitful guy, resembling Odysseus.
Even though that book was something taken as a giver of universal facts.
Of wisdom.
I would say of principles that are timeless.
Yes.
Principles that are true whenever you are, wherever you are. We can even see nowadays the former British Prime Minister,
Boris Johnson.
Reciting the Iliad in Greek.
I recite to myself, Main Thea Peleia Jo Akileos, Ulomanein, Homuria Kaios Algiatheke.
Yes.
We could even say that in Eton College, in the college of the elites of Great Britain and
future
the
prime
Empire,
ministers, yes.
We have the Iliad that is, we could say, fed to them.
Taken as a code.
Exactly.
The Iliad is taken as a code of conduct.
We could say that George Patton had the Iliad as his favorite book. We could say that multiple U.S. generals, CEOs, commanders, had the Iliad as the Bible.
Pretty much.
So why? Why was that? What was so interesting and important about the Iliad that made it rewritten for millennials?
Every year, there's at least a dozen translations of this book.
Why?
To this day.
Why is it so important that people, the elites, decide to spend money and finance that book to be rewritten throughout the ages? Why?
While it seems foreign, exotic, and antique to us, it is nevertheless very familiar. We have to begin with that first chapter, I think, the rage of Achilles. Like I said, rage is the very first word. What sets this book into, and by the way, the Iliad doesn't encompass the entire Trojan War. It's not quite like the movie where Paris takes Helen and then Achilles gets struck in the heel and there's
no. You need to forget the movie. The movie is a simplified...
It's still nice, it's still entertaining and has some morals, but not quite as much as the original book, of course.
So forget about the movie, okay? We're talking to you about the book. We're talking to you about chapter 1 of the Iliad, written by Homer, and it begins with the rage of Achilles. So Achilles went in a rage, in a furious rage, in a destructive endeavor. Why was that?
Because the whole plot of this Iliad, of this book, now the Trojan War takes place over the course of 10 years.
What is history?
Man.
No, who makes history?
Man.
And what is history?
Women.
Voila.
Right.
The fair maiden Helen of Sparta was abducted by Paris. Paris, the son of King Priam, who had 50 children with multiple magnificent fair maiden. Well, one of them, of course, was left. He was left to be killed by a shepherd who couldn't have the courage to do it. Why? Because his sister, Cassandra, who was gifted the talent of prophecy, but because she refused Apollo, well, Apollo decided to take from her the power of persuasion. And therefore Cassandra became the one who used to prophesy the fall of Troy, but nobody used to believe her, right? Well, she told King Priam and the oracle, because the queen, before giving birth to Paris, had a dream that, that city would fall because of Paris. So Paris came back and abducted Helen of Sparta after a meeting with the Hellenes, the Danaans, Danaans, meaning the Greeks.
Or the Argives. The concept of the Greek was not yet born.
Exactly.
Because the Greek nation-state did not exist yet.
There was multiple nations.
Exactly. Multiple city-states. Multiple city-states. The knowledge that Carl was just espousing over there isn't within the Iliad itself, but audiences back then would enter a recital of the Iliad with this knowledge in the background.
Exactly.
You know, the Iliad exists within a broader tradition of storytelling, the Trojan cycle, which consists of such plays as there's a prequel to the Iliad, which also contains that prophecy about Paris, the beauty contest of the gods, which results in Aphrodite offering
the
Paris.
apple.
Exactly. And then subsequently the Odyssey, the Little Iliad, the Aeneid, so on and so forth. So audiences would enter this with a certain background knowledge to begin with.
So the Iliad is the basis, it's the foundation of Western culture and civilization.
The first great piece in the Western canon.
It is pre-Christian. You could take the Bible, and before the Bible, you should take the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad and the Odyssey have universal principles that are true whenever you are, wherever you are. So it starts with the rage of Achilles. Why was Achilles enraged?
Because he had a petty quarrel with Agamemnon.
Who was Agamemnon?
Agamemnon, he's the king of kings, but not king as we might say in the modern days.
He's the first amongst his peers.
He's not a divine right monarch. He's not Louis XIV. He's just inherited this scepter, the scepter being the indicator of legislative authority from Zeus, and therefore he is what's called a basileus, in Greek meaning like a chieftain, a warlord kind of. He is the preeminent warlord amongst his peers. He's the brother of Menelaus, the king of Sparta, so there's many kings involved there. Agamemnon is simply the superior of them all.
Okay.
They're there to reclaim Helen, but ultimately they're there for honor and glory, and that's the crucial thing.
So that is the interesting thing, right? In the Iliad, you can see the different characters who embody, we could say, a certain type of man.
Yes.
So you have Agamemnon, whose sole goal is to unite the Greeks towards one common enemy, and therefore to have a bigger power towards the Greeks, because you know that nations are born in trivialities.
Yes, war makes the state and the state makes war.
Exactly. Therefore, he wanted to unite the Greeks under his banner. Therefore, he wanted to go to war. Now you have Menelaus, the brother of Agamemnon, who is going to war for vengeance. Now, after that, you have Achilles, who is going to war for kleos, meaning for glory. And after that, you have Odysseus. Odysseus, who was the smartest, the man of many twists and turns.
They call him Odysseus Polumetis, meaning many skills. Odysseus of many skills.
Exactly.
He's a bit of a cockroach, or not. Cockroach is not appropriate to say the fact that he's kind of unkillable, right? He becomes the hero of the next piece. The symbol for Odysseus is the octopus, because the octopus shifts its shape, and Odysseus is that very versatile, consummate political animal amongst the Greeks, and the favorite of Athena for being the most wise, the most eloquent, right? His foil, I would say, is Ajax, the king of Telemonia, while
Let me just finish the description of Odysseus.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So Odysseus was the man of the silver tongue.
Yeah.
He was the man who used to not be the best on the battlefield, but the most cunning and intelligent. Mm-hmm. And therefore, he was requested to go to war with them because of his qualities. Well, Odysseus was kind of forced to go to war with them. He didn't want to. He wanted to stay with his young wife, Penelope, and young son, Telemachus.
Yeah.
And therefore, his only goal was to return to his family. Like, he was going there by force. So you have the different types of men who go to war. One for glory, one for vengeance, one for spoils, and one to assert his dominance, and one doesn't even want to be here, right? So, and afterwards, you have Ajax.
Right,
yes.
Ajax is kind of the foil of Odysseus. Together, you have a lot of stories of Ajax and Odysseus together, and I want to discuss that at a later point. Whereas Odysseus is very cunning and intelligent, and Polumetis, many skilled, Ajax is described as Megas Telemonia Ajax, meaning the great Telamonian Ajax, king of the Telamonians. Now, each of these kings, the political order which exists in the Iliad is an egalitarian aristocracy. There are no rights in the Homeric Greece. We're not dealing with classical Greece. We're not dealing with democratic Athens. We're dealing with something which is even more antique than that. It is archaic Greece. It is politics without politics. I'll get into that in a second. And Ajax is very monolithic. He's kind of brutish, kind of what they would call in Latin stupiditas is the word they used to describe Ajax. Very monolithic, very pursuant. He has a sort of egotistic absolutism that is superhuman, Ajax. He's the foil to Odysseus, I would say, and the second to Achilles. Like, he's Achilles' peer. He's the second most proficient warrior after Achilles, I would say.
I see. So Achilles was enraged because Agamemnon took his Briseis.
What the book might call a war bride. And before I want to continue, let's go into the idea of kleos. Kleos meaning honor, meaning glory, but a specific type of honor and glory, that which allows you to assert your status against your peers, kind of, and the type of glory which reverberates throughout history.
So you need to understand that the Greeks used to view life as the growing of a fruit. Each individual was part of a tree. He was a fruit. And the fruit needed to be taken from the tree when he was the most ripe. Meaning, a man needs to die at 30. Voila. A man needs to be dead at 30. Why? Because that's when he's the most ripe. That's when his will to power is the more dense.
Is at its maximum.
Exactly. And he needs to assert his will to power at 30 and die at 30.
Yes.
Voila. And in pursuit of what?
In pursuit
Riches? Materiality? No. Kleos.
Kleos meaning immortality. That's the Greek, or the archaic Greek idea of the afterlife. They didn't quite have Elysium. There is some allusion to Hades in there. But the Greek immortality is your name being spoken after
What does
death.
Hector says? Hector goes to Achilles and he says, "Why are you here?" He says, "Because that war will be remembered for thousands of years." And then Hector asks him, "Yes, but in 1,000 years, our bones will turn into dust."
Yes, we'll be amongst the sand.
Yes, Prince, but our names will remain. Right? So the concept of kleos is to be immortal.
Yes.
How? Immortal in the minds of men.
But through the performance of great deeds. Now, kleos, honor, it's something visible. This is a zero-sum game. I mentioned it is politics without politics. What we are dealing with here is not democratic Athens. There's no institutions and no laws. This is a conflict of aristocratic households against one another. It is politics without politics, and politics without politics is the essence of politics. It is more or less a game of might makes right.
Actually, philosophizing politics, like having a conceptualized politics, is a certain justification for a certain decadence in the political system.
What Nietzsche said is ancient Greece was the fittest society ever. And he's not talking about democratic Greece when he says that. He's talking about Homeric Greece, because it was the least decadent and had the most vitality.
So we need to understand that those city-states had a certain political system that wasn't even like thought of.
No.
It was simple. It was. Meaning, you have the father who has a son.
Yes, the basic
right?
political unit is the household, the
Yep.
oikos.
You have a family, right?
Yes.
There's a certain hierarchy in the family, right? So the father and the son are not equal.
No.
Voila, right? And then the family becomes a tribe, right? And as you've seen in our video of Fustel de Coulanges, if you have not, well, you should definitely go. Because all of our videos like link themselves up together, right? So we can go back to
as all knowledge does. It's not a coincidence. It's just as all knowledge does.
You don't need to know many things. You need to know one thing. And that one thing...
is the Iliad.
No, well... and that one thing is discovered throughout our videos. Like all of those writers we talk about, they're trying to explain to you one thing, one essence, one principle, one primordiality. As René Guénon would say, you should go see that video too. Actually, you should go see all of our videos. It's so magnificent and exceptional. Anyways, so those cities used to have a certain tribe-like regime.
Yes, these were small face-to-face communities. The nation, or not even the nation, this is pre-nationhood. These small citizen communities were very face-to-face. The community was not some abstract thing, as it is the case with the modern nation-state. Modern countries are so vast that you only perceive your nation through the perception of some abstract symbols and motifs and songs and flags and whatever. No, not in antique Greece. Your community was the people that you were face-to-face against.
So Odysseus was the eldest in Ithaca. So Odysseus was the eldest of his tribe, therefore he was the king, right? And he had clients, meaning strangers who used to work his land. And the aristocrats were his cousins, right?
Yes.
And he used to marry, like those kings used to marry the daughters or the sisters of other kings. Therefore, they were one family.
Yes.
And who was Agamemnon? He was just the first amongst his peers.
He had the most, let's say, developed community.
Exactly.
One of the most resources.
He wasn't like, he didn't have a direct power on them.
Exactly. And he was not the gifted warrior that Achilles was or the cunning tactician that Odysseus was. He simply had the most resources.
You could say it's like the Confederate States in the US.
Go on.
You could say that the Confederate States used to have a certain independence between themselves, but
Yes.
their conception of the nation was one where self-rule was immanent and was a certain principle that is
Yes.
inherent. And that is what it was, right? They were united towards international relations and war, but they were completely independent together. So they needed a common enemy. That's why Agamemnon was so willing to go to war, so he could assert his own power.
Yes. Yes. What we have here is an egalitarian aristocracy. There are no rights in ancient Greece. You are not entitled to anything. There's no, because by the way, the concept of universal innate rights is a liberal concept which comes from the idea of a Christian God, right? Universal rights is a Christian idea. This is, as Carl said, before Christ. How many years before Christ? Roughly 850 years before Christ. So there's no concept of rights. There's no concept of I am entitled to this, I am entitled to that. But there are privileges and there are obligations, right? You have a privilege. Being an aristocrat is somehow a privilege. You get to vote in your assembly, you get to have people tending to your field, but you also have an obligation, which is if you vote to go to war, it means you yourself are going to war. And so the balance of privileges and obligations gives rise to the idea of citizenship.
You know, that was the beauty in 20th century politicians, right? Parliamentarians. You had Winston Churchill, who used to vote for war, and after the Dardanelles.
The Dardanelles Strait, yes.
Yeah, the disaster of the Dardanelles, where he was blamed, but therefore you cannot say that he was
He was not responsible for it.
He was not responsible for it,
Yes.
but he was just the scapegoat. Well, we could say to cleanse himself, he did go to war afterwards. And you could say that those politicians who voted for war, like the son of Winston Churchill, Randolph, was himself a commando, right?
Yes.
You could say that Lord Asquith, I would say the biggest socialites in London at that time, his son died in war, right? Like we could say that if politicians had a big stake into the nation,
Yeah.
we could say that if politicians had lots of land in the nation, they would be more willing to take wiser decisions, and especially if they were obligated to send their sons to wars, I would believe that the wars would be more legitimate.
More noble.
more legitimate, more for the sake of the common good, for the interest of the whole people. Anyways, you were saying...
So there's no idea of rights, there's privileges which are balanced with obligations, giving rise to the idea of citizenship, and the way that you measure your status amongst your peers was with your proficiency, not simply in war fighting. Okay, so we're in pre-politics, conflicts, households are led by the unilateral rule of the father, and so the way that conflicts are resolved more often than not is through war. And so this is a society where men, therefore, must seek to outdo each other in all domains. It's like you and I when we're training, for example. I would say, like, I'm going to do 30 sit-ups. And you say, I'm going to do 40. And I'm like, no, I'm going to do 42 then.
As iron sharpens iron, as friends sharpen friends.
Exactly. It's a very Greek idea. The idea to outdo each other and be competitive is a very, very Greek idea. And you must, because more often than not, conflicts are resolved through war fighting. So the qualities which are valued, those qualities which give rise to kleos, are those which are the ones which produce a proficient fighter.
Honestly,
a proficient combatant.
What is history other than different will powers?
That's all it is.
Striking each other. And what is religion other than the mean to preserve the will?
This background information sets the scene for the Iliad, for its social order. Why does this conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon have so much importance, and why does it set the entire plot of this book into motion? Let's begin with this. Yeah, these are demigods and kings and whatever the heck, but the conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon is a very familiar one. You might even recognize it in your own life. Every Achilles has his Agamemnon, and every Agamemnon has his Achilles. Whereas, this is even the critique which Achilles makes of Agamemnon. You have your power only because you have the greatest number of men who stand behind you. You're not virtuous. Your father bestowed you this scepter, but he didn't bestow you any courage.
Well,
the
yes.
critique that Diomedes, another gifted warrior.
It's meritocracy against...
bureaucratic authority.
Exactly.
The appeal of Achilles is somehow a challenger to Agamemnon because he is by far the most gifted fighter. And in his fit of rage, Achilles very nearly slaughters Agamemnon, but Athena strikes him and grants him a moment of wisdom, and he resheaths his sword.
I love what you just said. Athena striked him.
Yes.
Now, let's explain that concept of the gods.
We need to.
So the gods, at that time, nowadays we see the gods as being like fairy tales, like being...
it's almost fictional even.
Yes, but for them, they were living.
Yes.
The gods. The gods were part of themselves.
They were within you. The gods were within you.
Olympus was literally within you.
Yeah, literally.
Literally,
it's
right?
your interior kingdom. Your Olympus is
so
your
when
interior
Nikita just said that Athena struck Achilles, what he meant wasn't that like a fair young lady just came and slapped him.
Exactly.
No, it means that reason came back to him.
The gods and the goddesses were there to personify the emotions that the Greeks felt.
For example, if I tell Nikita at that time, Nikita, I became more reasonable. He would understand what I'm saying nowadays. Yes. But back in the days, there wasn't that word reason.
Yes.
There was Athena, meaning, Nikita, Athena just struck me. And he would be, oh.
Or like I'll be playing the piano and I'll say something like, oh, I never took lessons.
Apo.
I'll be like, oh, I never took lessons. And someone will ask, well, how did you learn? And I'll say, oh, Aphrodite is whispering the notes to me.
Well, simple. Or for example, Nikita, when he walks into his local pub, every single fair maiden knows exactly what's the deal. Well, in other words, he is well versed in the secrets and the delicacies of Aphrodite.
You could say, like, that's why part of why the Iliad is relevant. That's called kleos. Like, before I read the Iliad, before I understood the Iliad, if that had happened to me in the past, I'd be all shy, like, oh, why is everyone looking at me? But nowadays, if I walk into the pub, the local pub, and I see a dozen heads turn in my direction, and I have no idea who they are, I'm like, that's kleos.
You see?
That's kleos. My name is being spoken in rooms where I am not present. That's literally kleos.
You see, because...
What we might call nowadays aura.
Voila. Exactly. Well, Nikita is the most invasive when he is not here.
Literally like Achilles.
Everybody misses him. And that is the essence of kleos. What is the will to have lots of Instagram followers? Kleos! Like, what is that will of having attention? Of having your name spoken of? It's the will to kleos. It's from the Greeks. So the concept of being an influencer was first started by Achilles, right?
Pretty much. Having aura was started by the ancient Greeks.
He was like Achilles was the first influencer, and Alexander was his first main groupie.
No, but it's no joke. This conversation of like the fact that people call it aura nowadays. You see those TikTok reels, whatever. Oh, he has aura, plus 10 aura, minus 100 aura. Like, it's literally Kleos. In book 3, Helen inspects the champions. Helen and Priam and the others are at the walls of Troy, looking at the armies before them. And you're able to point out who has the most aura. Priam points at Agamemnon. Who is that man with the shiny golden armor? He has aura. He points at Odysseus. Who is that man with the boar-tusk helmet and the broad chest? Helen points out, that's Odysseus.
Thumos.
Thumos, yeah, literally, like the desire for recognition. Like, yeah, Thumos is literally the chest is the place where Thumos resides. Thumos meaning your desire for recognition. Who was that? C.S. Lewis, I think it was.
Who said, we are not building men with chests.
We are raising men without chests nowadays, men with no desire for recognition, right? And she points out, Priam points out Ajax. Who is that monster amongst men, that giant man wielding that axe? So you would have aura back then. You could tell who the aristocrats were because they had aura.
Physicality.
Kleos.
Let's say it.
Yes.
The aristocrats were the true and the beautiful, right? Like, there was a big correlation between beauty
and goodness,
aesthetics, being jacked and being intelligent.
Literally.
Voilà, you need to understand that. Nowadays, they want to separate it, right?
Yes.
But being jacked, flex, right? Intelligent was one. You could not be intelligent if you were not jacked.
Your psychology is your physiology.
Voilà.
Your physiology is the outward expression of your psychology.
You need to have a great temple for it to have an incredible spirit.
You must have a luscious Olympus.
Voilà.
No, that's a bit...
That's okay. No, that's okay. So, anyways, that is why, my dear friends, you need to get jacked before you can think right.
No, beauty is goodness.
Voilà.
What are some of the indicators of Kleos? Because Kleos is what they use to determine your standing in classical antiquity.
You know, I'll tell you something. Nietzsche used to say that there was, Nietzsche, as we've discussed it many times, was a philologist. Okay, he was a man who used to study the evolution of words, meaning
the evolution of thought.
Right. So he noticed something quite interesting. In his word "good and evil," he explains how being good and being bad was completely misinterpreted by modern day writers. Right. A bad man, in the Homeric sense, was an incapable man.
A weak man.
It was a man who was not useful.
Couldn't defend his family, couldn't express himself in the assembly, had no respect amongst his
peers. You know what
peers.
Arnold Schwarzenegger says? And it was the title of his last book. Be useful.
Be useful.
Be useful. Right? Well, that was the essence of Greek culture. You need to be useful.
Yeah.
You need to offer something to the community. When you're a man, you're somebody who needs to give something in exchange of recognition.
Either you must defend your city-state on the battlefield, either you must represent your position through your oration in the assembly.
Voilà.
You have to be productive.
Magnificent. Or either you can make videos on YouTube, right?
Sure.
That's one option.
That's kind of a...
Being a good man was somebody who was capable, was somebody who used to produce.
Strong.
Who used to offer something to the community. So you need to understand that there has been a certain inversion of
values.
Of values, exactly.
Yes.
Nietzsche used to say, I mock those people who think they are virtuous because they have no
claws.
No claws. Because, Achilles was strong and powerful because his mother, who was a nymph, right? I've known many of them. And she used to put him in a river, the Styx River, the river of the death. And his sole weakness was his ankle, right? Because she was holding him from here, right? She couldn't just drop him. Therefore, that would make him pay the price afterwards. Now, anyways, I would say let's discuss about the symbolism of Troy and the Danaans. Troy, we could say, represents a certain type of people. The people who build with stones. The people who build to stay. The people who do not move, but just extend their reach.
When Walter Schliemann discovered Troy, it was buried, or what was called Ilion.
Ilion.
That's the etymology of the Iliad. It's the epic of Ilium, the epic of Troy.
Yes.
Troy was a city that had built itself on top of itself, right? Because there's no sewage system back then, no waste disposal. The city would keep on building on top of itself. When he discovered Troy, it was buried under a massive mound that the locals called in the local tongue, the fortress.
Yes.
And so he just dynamited his way through it. He actually dynamited too far and went all the way to the Bronze Age and ended up dynamiting the level of Troy, which would have corresponded to Homer's Greece.
Yes.
Right? But let's consider the way that the Trojans are depicted in this book. Homer is a Greek, of course, but he seems sometimes to favor the Trojans. You read this book, and I read this book at least, and I think sometimes like I would have rather have been a Trojan. Look at the conduct of the Trojans rather than a Greek, even though this is a Greek man telling the story. And this is really revealed in chapter 6. Helenus, who is one of Hector's brothers, says, we need to go and tell the noble women of Troy to pray and make a sacrifice to Athena in order to change the tide of the war. And who is sent to deliver this message? Not some peasant, not some mediocre soldier, but it's Troy. It's Hector. It's the Trojan hero. Surely Hector is more valuable on the battlefield than he is delivering a petty message in the city. So the reader immediately understands this is a narrative device of Homer to bring us inside the walls of Troy. And what we notice is Hector has a family. Hector has a son who he beloves. Hector has people that he looks after. The Trojans pray after the same gods. They have a very noble conduct. The depiction of what Homer has done.
But what is Achilles? Achilles is a miscreant. Achilles is somebody who swears at Apollo.
Yes.
Achilles is somebody who came into the temple and in front of Cassandra just destroyed the statue of Apollo.
What Homer does is he makes the Trojans very human. And to a great extent, that is one of the great morals of the Iliad. It is the admiration and the recognition of the humanity in the person that you despise, of your opponent, right? The Trojans are depicted as being very honorable.
We could see that even in the attitude of Achilles towards, like, in the Iliad. We can see at first he says there are no pacts between
lions and men,
and that is not just in the movie, that is in the book, right? There is no covenant between lions and men. And at the end, when King Priam comes to him and just begs for him and kisses his hand and looks at him and says, I have done what no man has ever done. I have kissed the hands of the man who has slaughtered my son.
Yeah.
My bravest son.
Not just my son, my many sons.
My many sons, but Hector was like the
my
heir.
My prize, my possession.
He was the heir of the city. And he has kissed his hands, and then you can see Achilles feeling remorse. You can see Achilles feeling that, remembering all of the faces of the men he had slaughtered, and saying that they would wait for him they would be waiting for him at the shore of the river. So he used to understand that war was just the confrontation of different wills. It was not emotional. It was not. There was no bad feelings.
Actually, I want to contest that because the men in the Iliad are actually very emotional.
Exactly,
right?
They're crying all the time.
It's contrary to the modern wisdom that men are offered nowadays.
They're crying all the time.
Like these epic warriors, these mythical warriors, are very emotional people.
Like Achilles cries when Agamemnon takes from him Briseis. Achilles cries when his cousin Patroclus dies. Achilles cries in his tent.
Hector cries when looking at his son. Priam cries at the death of Hector. Achilles and Priam cry with one another. Agamemnon cries when Zeus prophesies to him that he should just leave Troy. The men here are very emotional, right? And that's probably one of the worst pieces of wisdom that men are offered nowadays. Is like men are not emotional. It's not true, and any man knows it's not true. We are human after all. Each man has emotions, but it's what you do with your emotions. What are you laughing at?
I'm being emotional.
No, literally. Like, each man has emotions. It's what you do with your emotions, right? When Achilles slaughters one of the last of Priam's son, I forget, Laocoon.
Yes.
It's when Achilles is like in the river. Achilles clogs up the river with the bodies. Like it's after the death of Patroclus. He completely loses his mind. He goes on a supernatural outrage. The Laocoon is grabbing the shins of Achilles and pleading, supplicating to Achilles, forgive me, spare me, spare me. Achilles says, I have spared so many Trojans in the past, not now that you have killed my cousin. And he says, why do you fear death? I too, even as a half-mortal as I am, will confront it one day. And then slaughters him. So neither the brave man nor the coward can escape fate. Neither the brave man nor the coward can escape death. Each man suffers.
Everything is written, my
But
dear
not
friends.
each man pities himself.
So we could see how Achilles' heart softens a bit, right?
Throughout, he's described as Ironheart Achilles, Ajax, Odysseus. Everyone is telling him Ironheart Achilles.
We could see at the beginning how he says that there are no covenants between lions and men, and no, Hector, if you die, I will not grant you the rituals of being buried, like a proper prince. But at the end, we can see how Zeus decides to spare Hector. He decides to spare the body of Hector that was attached at the
chariot of Achilles.
At the chariot of Achilles, who was demonstrating him like just a piece of meat, like he wasn't the heir of the biggest prince of Asia Minor, right? And therefore,
Troy, which was the empire, by the way. Troy was an empire, right? It was not just one city.
Exactly. And therefore, Zeus decided to spare the body of the prince. It did not go into decay.
Yes.
And then when Priam came and pleaded with Achilles, and when he saw the love of a father for his now dead son, well, he could not but cry on the body of Hector. And he used to consider him as his most valuable friend. Hector for Achilles was, before being an enemy, was a friend.
Was a peer.
Exactly.
Was an equal.
It was kind of like Saladin and
King Baldwin.
Exactly.
Yes.
They were friends before being enemies.
Yes.
Because they understood that life, especially at war, was just the confrontation of wills. There was nothing emotional about it. Now, I just want to discuss about the correlation between the sedentary man, the man who establishes himself, who builds not establishes tents, but builds of stones, who is here to stay, and the man who is vigorous, who is young, who makes lots of babies, and who wants to take the land of the man who builds by stones. We could even say that's the story of St. George, right? St. George, the soldier who goes into the city and who sees a dragon who demands sacrifices of young ladies. We could even say that's like a fat king who wants a new woman every year, right? And St. George is the traveler. It's the man on a horse. It's the man of incredible physicality and strength. Is the vigorous man against the old man in decay who is staying at the same place all the time, right? We can see that throughout history, that we always have the sedentary, and that's a theory established by Ibn Khaldun, one of the greatest Arab scholars, who used to say that the vigorous man is the man who's on the move. It's the nomad. We could see that in T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, where he discusses how the man of the desert, who always walk the big dunes of sand, are, we could say, divided from the weak. Only the strong man survives the walking through the desert and the big dunes of sand.
And historically, special forces have always been recruited from highlands and mountains. That's the whole idea
the
of
Scottish,
the SAS. Yeah.
The Scottish, exactly.
The whole idea of the SAS.
Exactly.
Yep.
There are mountain people. There are people who are young and vigorous. Mm-hmm. And so we can see how Troy was the city of the sedentary people who decided, let's say that when you're not at war, you're in decay, right?
I wouldn't say so exactly. Troy is not decadent. Troy is not degenerate. In fact, for the most part of the story, the Trojans are kicking the asses of the Greeks, right? Even though the Greeks have more gifted fighters. Look at all the kings and fighters that the Greeks have. Even when Achilles is not on the battlefield, they still have Ajax and they still have Diomedes, for example. And still the Greeks are losing. The Greeks are pushed all the way back to their ships. The Trojans are not, I wouldn't say they're not quite decadent. But, what the Trojans have over the Greeks is they are organized. The Greeks suffer from their petty quarrels with one another. Their value system of kleos, and which we might describe by modern estimations, these men are kind of a disaster. They treat women as property. They're very materialistic and status-driven, and therefore we can say that they are morally bankrupt to a certain extent. We can deal with that later if we'd like to. The success of the Trojans is that they are organized, that they have a unified code of honor. What Homer is trying to offer his readers is a vision for Pan-Hellenism. He's trying to wonder, what might we, the Greeks, achieve if we unified ourselves? Greece has always been the front line of Western civilization. John Stuart, even later on, Homer kind of foresees what will happen in the Greco-Persian Wars, right? The Greeks could only defeat that vast empire. Who are the Greeks, by the way? Just a collection of city-states, a collection of small face-to-face communities. Defeating the empire Persia, 2 onslaughts of Persia, Darius, and then his son Xerxes. Why? Because they finally confederated.
You know, it's like the Italian cities against the French, right? And
Yes.
the Rinascimento
Yes.
with General Garibaldi.
Yes.
Right? It's always against a common enemy that a multiple
Yes.
city-states become one nation.
Yes.
We can see that with, let's not get into modern-day politics, but let's be honest, like Ukraine was kind of culturally part of Russia, right? Culturally.
Culturally.
But nowadays, the more and more war establishes itself,
The more these people become distinct from each other.
the more we could say they have a certain national identity because
Yes.
nations are forged in war.
Yes.
Right? Like,
Yes.
so, but, you know, the Spartans didn't have walls because men were considered as
And that was
walls.
this was what Thucydides said is the defect of the Athenians at the end of the Peloponnesian Wars. The Athenians hid behind their walls.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
So they became decadent because
Yes.
they thought that their walls were going to protect them. That's what I mean when I tell you that
Yes.
like Hector is not decadent, right?
Yes.
But the average man who doesn't understand anything about international relations or inter-city states relations, he would go into decay, right? Oh, the walls are protecting me.
Yes.
But the nomad,
Yes.
who has like 10 children,
And a cattle of livestock.
exactly, of livestock, and we can even relate that to Abel and
Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel, right? We have, so it's quite interesting. What was the occupation of those Greeks?
Of those Greeks?
All of them. All of them.
All of the Greeks? They were
Shepherds.
Shepherds.
Most of them were shepherds.
Yes.
Right? And it's like Abel, right?
Because, as I've said in the past, the terrain of Greece isn't very arable. You can't really grow crops there.
Exactly.
Yes.
It's mountainous, right? So those people were shepherds. Like you, just like Abel. Abel was a shepherd, right? And Abel used to be the man who can travel everywhere. He used to be the man who used to change location. He was a digital nomad, right? Abel used to be in Bali, and then he used to go to Mykonos, and he used to make money out of his sheep. Just like nowadays, right? He used to post a selfie on Instagram of this sheep. Up, likes, up, promo code, Abel, whatever.
Hashtag Abel.
Hashtag Abel. And up, he used to make money, correct? While you, Cain, you're just sitting here and in your office in the rat race. That's why you, Cain,
Typing
are
away on your Excel
jealous.
spreadsheets.
You're jealous of Abel, Cain. I can see it. You too want to become a digital nomad, right? So there was the certain cleavage between the nomads and I would say the sedentary, the shepherds,
Right.
the Abels and the Cains. That's a conflict that exists in history and has always existed.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme. It's kind of like a law of politics.
Very simple, very simple. So we were discussing of...
Yes, like Homer is presenting a vision for Pan-Hellenism.
Yes.
He's wondering what might the Greeks achieve if we actually unified, quit it with this petty quarrel. He kind of foresees...
Alexander.
He foresees Alexander the Great.
Yes.
He predicts so many... Homer is... In retrospect, it's almost like Homer predicted Greek history. What he's doing, he's not, as I've said in the past, the occupation of history is not the concern with precise details.
Do you know who he is? Like if you take the German history, right? He's the brother Grimm's. So the brother Grimm's...
He's more even antique than that, I would say.
No. What I mean by that is that the brother Grimm's were like from Germany.
I know what you, now I know what you mean. Yes.
They decided to unite the different German principalities. Yeah, throughout storytelling.
They would collect myths and tales from each part of Germany. Oh, Bavaria.
Exactly.
Here, there. Yes.
Exactly. So throughout myth, throughout similar storytelling,
Yes.
it was possible from Bismarck
Yes.
to unite it.
Yes, exactly.
Right? It starts with storytelling. So Homer
Absolutely.
decided to unite the different city-states with one book.
Yes.
With one book describing the history of those people.
Yes.
And after that, there's a political power who took that book
Athens.
as an instruction, Athens,
Yes.
and united the different city-states. So it starts
The Confederacy
first
of
all,
Delos.
So it starts with the spirit first. It starts with the storytelling first,
Yes.
which is quite interesting. Homer, yes, please.
So when Homer is giving us a history, as I've said in the past, the occupation of history is not to be mixed with the concern for precise details. The role of the modern historian as being a journalist of past times is kind of forfeit. It's kind of futile, if you ask me.
Yes.
When Thucydides gives a history of the Peloponnesian Wars, and he recites Pericles' funeral oration, one of the great speeches of antiquity of all time in the Western canon, he doesn't say Pericles said this. He says Pericles spoke like this, because as I've said, what is more valuable than the precise details of history is the wisdom of history. What Homer is doing is giving the Greeks a heroic past. He's giving the Greeks a heroic past to unite themselves under, which inevitably happens.
And
The
who
rise of
controls the
Athens,
past?
Who controls the present?
And who controls the present?
Who controls the future?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you control the past, right,
Yes.
with the book, you create a book, you control the past.
You produce a common history.
You produce a common history for the present, and therefore you control the present. And by controlling the present, therefore,
Yes.
you control the future. So it all starts with the past. It all starts with a common denomination between every single entity forming the future state. You need to envision the future of that state. You need to envision the future of that empire. Even Oswald Spengler would say that the Greeks at that time were creating something called culture. They were creating something essential.
The birth of culture.
And Alexander was nothing more than the empirical vision of Greeks.
Yes.
Alexander the Great even himself went into decay when he met all of those Persians and became, like he used to describe the Persians as being effeminate and a bit precious and pretentious, right? But when he arrived at the beautiful gardens of Babel, right, he decided to himself adopt some Persian culture, right? So we could say that it all starts, and that's a lot of Oswald Spengler, it all starts with an idea that is internal. It's like the United States with their isolationism, right? First of all, they're turned towards themselves. And after their isolationism, they start with the 14 points of Wilson. So it starts with the Monroe Doctrine, which is creating a certain culture, and then
Wilson
just
doctrine,
spreading
exportation of it.
And the more you
Yes.
spread it, the more we could say the nation becomes an empire, and an empire will ultimately fall. According to Spengler, of course, right? Mm-hmm. And the phase before the fall of an empire,
Is the decadence.
Caesarism, according to Spengler, of course.
Interesting.
So we could say that the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? Let me put it that way, is the father and the mother of every single philosophy.
That's the way to put it.
Every single philosophy is just an explanation. Plato, Aristotle,
Sophocles, Euripides, whoever.
all of them, everything they're doing is explaining the Iliad.
When democratic Athens emerges, you didn't quite have laws, right? So Homer gives this history of aristocratic strife and so on. It's the truth of archaic Greece. Eventually, there's that process of synoikism. The family becomes a tribe, yada, yada. You get a city, right? What Solon does in order to stop the aristocratic strife, he creates demos
The
kratos.
laws of Solon.
Yes, demos kratos, people power. And part of the way to empower the people is make your laws ambiguous so that they can be interpreted by a jury of your peers. So there weren't quite laws in ancient Athens. People wouldn't make orators and sophists wouldn't make appeals to laws. They would make appeals to the Iliad. That's what they would do as they orated in classical Athens.
Even during the Napoleonic Wars, there were some soldiers, some cavalrymen, who used to charge at the enemy without the saddle. Why? Because in their minds, they used to tell people, oh, because the Greeks used to do that. So those people used to live in the Iliad and the Odyssey, correct?
Yes.
Like, let's be clear, George S. Patton, used to have the Iliad recited to him every night before sleeping since he was a child. Let's be clear on that. So the Iliad is something very up-to-date. It's futuristic.
No, it's futuristic. It seems antique, but it's still
reality.
so relevant. Every Achilles has his Agamemnon. Every Ajax has his Odysseus. Every Hector has his Paris, right? We haven't departed from these petty quarrels. And every man is confronted with the bargain that Achilles is offered, which is, you could stay and reign over your father's kingdom, and you will live a peaceful life. You'll have many wives, you'll have many kids. Or you can go to Troy. You can sack Troy, but you will die an early death. Every man is confronted with this bargain in his life. And here's your offer. You can live a comfortable life. You can live a life as I say, fleeting vanities, right? Or you could live a life of dignified struggles, of dignified and elevated hardships. A life of challenges, a life of difficulties.
You need to choose quality.
The choice
over
is
quantity.
yours. Every man has to confront this bargain. We haven't departed from that today. Like, I used to have a philosophy of life where I was a bit disappointed by the petty behavior I saw from the people around me from sometimes, the personal vendettas, the immaturity, the squabbling, the gossip, whatever. And for a period of time, I just decided I'm going to resign myself from all of this. I'm just going to stay at home, listen to my symphonies, and read my books, and tend to my collection of rare books. But then I was reminded of Achilles, like, I could do that, but I will never become the Nikita I want to become.
So, voilà.
Yes.
That is Nikita who became a monk, right? And established what Homer did for the Greeks, meaning a certain identity.
Yes.
What is Nikita? Nikita is an idea. It's a concept. And now Nikita is spreading. So now Nikita is Nikita is in his Alexander phase, right? After Homer established what is Greece,
The wisdom.
right?
Yes.
Alexander took the sword and spread it.
Yes.
After the ideas of enlightenment decided to conceptualize those ideas. Who took the sword and just spread it? Napoleon!
Yes.
Voilà. So Nikita right now is spreading Nikita. You see what I mean?
No, but everybody has to do that.
Exactly.
You conceive yourself throughout your adolescence, through
Voilà.
your experience, through your media, through your challenges. Everybody, as I've said in the René Guénon video, an adolescent crisis is useful and necessary. You establish yourself and then you expand yourself, for example.
Complètement.
Right? Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's return again to Agamemnon. Agamemnon's base of power is simply the amount of people that stands behind him. Agamemnon is the most powerful. But the Iliad reveals a very essential truth about power politics. Here's what power will allow you to achieve. Power will allow you to extricate yourself from subjugation. Agamemnon takes orders from nobody. Nobody. He even spites the gods sometimes, Agamemnon. So power will allow you to extricate yourself from subjugation, but not from the dynamics of power relations.
But even himself, Agamemnon, even if he takes power from no one, he's the one who had to sacrifice his daughter before going on campaign, right? So he took his daughter and he decided to make of her an offering to the gods, because it was a precondition for the victory of the Danaans or the Argives or the Greeks.
The Achaeans.
The Achaeans.
Yes.
So even Agamemnon, even himself who takes no orders from any mortal, was subjugated, was subdued by the will of the gods.
Which we might call in the modern day, in the realist lens, the dynamics of power relations. What does this mean? So Agamemnon can take Briseis from Achilles. He can. He has the ability to do that. But what is the consequence? Achilles refuses to partake in the war, and his men get slaughtered. Agamemnon can spite the priest of Apollo and say, no, go away, I'm not going to return your daughter. He can do that. But what results is Apollo casts a plague and decimates his numbers. And in so doing, by wielding his power, by expending it, he loses his basis of power. Yeah, okay, he can cast a plague, he can indirectly, inadvertently cast a plague upon his men, but by decimating his men, he decimates the base of his power, right? So you can escape from subjugation, but not from the dynamics of power relations. It is Achilles ultimately who calls the assembly to discuss the fate of Briseis and Chryseis, and he almost says it in such a way which is, you should be calling this assembly, mighty king. It makes us wonder, therefore, whether it is status, the status of Agamemnon, or the conduct of Achilles, which should determine the honor of men.
Well, we could say that Agamemnon is more of the symbolic king, right? But
The wielder of the scepter.
who wields real power in the dynamics of powers, right?
The one with the spear.
It's Achilles. It's like
Yes.
nowadays, right? You can see lots of heads of states who look like they wield the power, but if you look deep into it, you have lots of personal interests, right? You have lots of, I would say, personal interests that are at stake, correct? You can see lots of businessmen, for example, that are behind the decorum of the state. You can see that real power resides in the ability and the competency and the ability to provide, I would say, results on a financial level of certain people. We all have our Achilles in our resembling states with Agamemnon wielding the scepters. We all have businessmen who fund and who wage wars against the enemies of the state through financial, or we could even say, aggressive acquisitions. And those are the Achilles of modern times.
Yes. The appeal of Agamemnon comes from the scepter, from bureaucratic authority. The appeal of Achilles comes from the spear. And even later on in chapter 9, the embassy to Achilles, Diomedes, who is another gifted warrior, makes the same critique of Agamemnon. Your father bestowed you that scepter, but he didn't bestow you any courage, O king of kings, O lord of men. Now, the value system here is very problematic. Each man seeks to spite the other, and each man seeks to outdo the other between Achilles and Agamemnon. What results, though, is that their petty, individualistic, interpersonal quarrel has consequences for the entire political community, right? So maybe it is not status which should determine honor amongst men, it is conduct. Now, should and ought and what it is are different things, right? Just because we might have some ideals doesn't mean it is productive to abide by them, right? There's also that interaction in chapter 5 between Diomedes and one of the Trojan warriors, Glaucus. There's that concept of xeneia in Greece as well. Xeneia meaning the mutual obligation between friends, right? Why is Achilles so emotional? I don't think it's just to say that Achilles is just an emotional baby. I'd say more so that it's that Achilles has been dishonored. Agamemnon has violated the xeneia towards Achilles, and somehow Achilles is justified.
What is the xeneia? It's the distribution of the spoils of war.
It's the mutual obligations to one another.
Yes, but we could even say it's the distribution of the spoils of war, because who was Briseis?
It was his war bride. It was kind of his war trophy.
Exactly, and that is a sacred duty for a king to distribute the we could say the spoils of war.
Right.
To the warriors, the meritocratic warriors. Yes. So Agamemnon was being a corrupted king.
Exactly. He was not honoring the xeneia.
Exactly. He was not honoring the spoils of war, because, and therefore he was punished by the gods. How? Because Achilles didn't fight with him, and Achilles has the best warriors. Achilles had not the biggest numbers of warriors, but he had the best. He had quality over quantity. He had the
Myrmidons.
The Myrmidons, right?
Yes.
And Achilles was the one who used to charge in front of the troops for the sake of Kleos. He didn't care about the winning or losing, actually. He just cared about medals. He just cared about
his own pride.
Meritocracy.
Yes. And so this idea of xeneia comes back between the interaction of Diomedes, who's another excellent Greek warrior, and Glaucus, who was one of the proficient Trojan warriors. As I said, aristocracy, aura, these men recognize each other. Before Diomedes chops him down like he does with every other man, he says, "Who are you?" And in Greece, when you ask, "Who are you?" it means, "Who is your forefathers?"
Yes.
Right? And
what's your lineage?
Exactly. Like, who do you come from? Right? Are you worth respecting? Right? Glaucus and Diomedes exchange their family lineages with each other, and what they discover is their great-grandfathers had a xeneia with each other. What Diomedes and Glaucon discover is that as a result of the mutual obligation they have for each other, they lay down their arms. These are the two most proficient warriors, the guys with the most kleos. You can imagine, let's say, in a sports match, the two stars of either team not putting down their arms and not choosing to confront each other out of sheer honor, out of sheer respect. And what this tells us somehow is that we can cultivate rational thought against each other.
But yes, we could even say that we all inherit the sins and the virtues of our ancestors, because their ancestors had a common covenant between themselves, right? They decided to uphold it.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Like we could even say that that is the importance of a family, of establishing a righteous family.
Yes.
Because all of your sins, your virtues, your principles, everything good or bad that you do will come in one way or the other to your descendants.
Right. And so Diomedes and Glaucon alert us to the fact that the alternative to petty squabbling is rational conservation, the cultivation of rational thought, which brings us into democratic Athens.
And that is the importance of reputation, I would say. Reputation is something like kleos could even be translated into reputation.
Yeah.
Right? It's okay if Achilles died on the battlefield. At least Achilles, son of Peleus, right?
Yeah.
His son
of Peleus.
Peleus. His son will be remembered as son of Achilles, like Achilles, the crazy guy who is right?
And the fact that these two guys can have this rational conversation with each other is only because they respect each other's status.
Yeah, because, we're the sons of the studs.
Exactly.
Yes.
We shouldn't be warring against each other.
Exactly.
Go fight another Trojan. Go fight another Greek.
Yes.
It's literally that.
Exactly.
Like, there's plenty of other men for you to chop down. Don't waste your time with me, man.
Voilà.
Yes.
Exactly. So we would say that the Iliad is a book that is timeless.
We haven't escaped its conditions. 3,000 years later, we're still living in the Iliad.
Those are universal principles that are true whenever and wherever you are.
Yes.
That is why instead of reading all of that, we could say mental squabbling of self-help book, the so-called self-help book, you can come and take universal principles that are true every single time, every single day. You can feel while reading the Iliad that it was written for you. The Iliad is more spiritual than external.
Exactly. You can identify yourself in any one of the many characters in that book. The first book of the Iliad, that first 30 pages, has more wisdom, more practical advice, more spiritual advice than all of the self-help books combined together. There is a reason why we are reading it to this day. It is not simply a collection of words imprinted upon the page. It is a song which reverberates throughout history. It's no wonder that Patton read it every night before he went to sleep. It's no wonder Alexander kept it beneath his pillow.
Boris Johnson used to recite it in ancient Greek.
Men adea thea pelia deo Achilles.
Exactement.
Exactly.
And therefore, we could understand that books that were preserved, books that were financed by the richest people and the most intelligent and selective men throughout history, have something to teach us. And we could surely understand that the Friday Salon is the modern day Homer, collecting, recollecting, establishing, expanding, extending.
Each man collects the stories and the tales of his own life. You may not recall after all those years the precise details of each book you've read, but you can always recall their wisdom. You can always recall their aesthetic sensation. You can always recall how it made you feel once upon a time.
You can always come back to the Friday Salon and refresh your mind.
You can always rewatch our videos.
With the greatest of classics, the greatest extension of human minds that ever lived. Therefore, I would say, my dear friends, we have a certain link in our description.
As always.
An incredible edition of the Iliad. You should definitely buy it. You should definitely read it.
This is the one book every person should read. If you read one book in your life, it has to be this.
Because it is individuals that make families. It is families that create the state. The state actually emanates from the family. And the family emanates from a man. And man emanates from universal principles that are written and preserved for centuries. The Iliad is the basis of Western civilization and canon.
The first great work. The first great work.
And therefore I would say that that is a sure voila.
Voilà qui je suis.
C'est phénoménal.
Mes amis, c'est